It seems to me to be equally plain that no business which depends for existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country. That, my friends, was Franklin D. Roosevelt. Hello, my friends. This is Ruben, and in today's video, we're going to learn about the history behind the minimum wage and the living wage. We will begin with the concept about when the minimum wage first came about, how it was first implemented, and how it connects to a living wage. From there, we're going to talk about the concept of the living wage and why it is important. Now, my friends, this is part 1 of a 5-part series on the living wage. While watching this video, subscribe and tick the notification bell so that you can be informed on when part 2 of this 5-part series is released. We cannot begin a discussion on living wage without first having a discussion on the minimum wage. Minimum wage is best defined as the lowest amount an employer can legally pay their employees. Laws regarding a minimum wage didn't actually start talking about a minimum wage. In fact, it was talking about a maximum wage. The discussion begins with the Ordinance of Labourers issued by King Edward III on 1349. This was a response to the loss of workers due to the Black Death decimating approximately 30% of the English population, with some estimates indicating 60% of the European population and a third of all Middle Easterners perished during this time. The ordinance indicated that employers could not pay employees wages greater than the pre-plague levels. Essentially, this has placed a maximum wage allowed to employees. Enforcement of this ordinance was extremely difficult, that it caused the English Parliament to pass the Statute of Labourers in 1351. It was widely unpopular, and while there were some improvements made in the following centuries, it wasn't until the passage of the Act of Fixing a Minimum Wage in 1604 by King James I in regards to textile workers that minimum wage actually became formalized. Now, this essentially gave the justice of the peace the right to regulate not only a maximum wage, but also a minimum wage. And just like that, the fight for the minimum wage has begun. Textile workers have continued to play an important part in the history of the minimum wage. The 1912 Lawrence Textile Strike of Lawrence, Massachusetts, also known as the Bread and Roses Strike, came about when the government of Massachusetts passed a law that limited the working week of women and children. And that's right, you heard me say that correctly, women and children. Now, the working week was reduced from 56 hours to 54 hours. Now, at first, everyone was okay, but then they realized that the companies were starting to reduce the wages as well. And that wasn't okay. Now, this resulted in a massive 20,000 textile workers strike beginning on January 11th and did not end until March 14th. The city responded by ordering local militias to patrol the streets and break the strike. Even the state of Massachusetts responded by ordering state militias and state police to also patrol the streets and break the strike. However, none of that worked. With the loss of income, sometimes not only from adult workers, but also child workers, families had trouble feeding their children and started sending them by train to New York in order to live with relatives and strangers. This was causing a huge embarrassment for the state of Massachusetts, and the city and state police tried to quell this and try to stop it, and they tried, and what ended up happening is they started beating and arresting women who were trying to send their kids off on the train. The aftermath of this horrific event resulted in a win for the strikers. On March 12, 1912, the American Wooling Company agreed to the strikers' demands. Soon after, the remainder of the textile companies followed suit and also agreed to the strikers' demands. Within just a short few years, as the labor unions began to falter, the gains that were won in the Bread and Roses strike were completely wiped out. An unfortunate ending for the fight for better working conditions. Something soon blossomed from the death of this progress, and on January 5th, 1914, Henry Ford of the Ford Motor Company increased the daily wage from $2.34 to $5 a day, a roughly 200% increase in the daily minimum wage for all male workers. This is the equivalent of nearly $18 an hour today. That's greater than the minimum wage we have currently. Not only that, but on May 1st, 1926, the Ford Motor Company introduced a 5-day, 40-hour work week with profit sharing for a certain percentage of workers. Talk about being ahead of his time. It took the nation a little while to get behind the idea of a minimum wage. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 was enacted by Congress and signed into law by FDR. This law stated that the federal minimum wage was 25 cents per hour, that there is a 5-day, 40-hour work week, that there is overtime pay, and the abolishment of child labor. However, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 failed to tie the federal minimum wage to any sort of index, such as a consumer price index or even inflation index. Today, this is roughly equivalent to approximately $5 per hour. Why did we have to talk about a minimum wage before we can even begin the discussion of a living wage? Well, it's because a minimum wage is best defined as the minimum income required to pay, whereas a living wage is best defined as the minimum income necessary to live. To put it further, a living wage is best defined as the minimum income necessary for a worker to meet their basic needs without any government assistance or programs. It is important to note that basic needs does not mean the bare minimum needs. In fact, it is very important to note that a living wage is best defined with a quality of life that includes healthcare, housing, food, education, and even entertainment. It seems to me to be equally plain that no business which depends for existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country. He goes on to say, and by living wages, I mean more than a bare subsistence level. I mean the wages of decent living. Now that statement that I just played for you again was actually made by FDR in regards to the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933. And then just 2 short years later, the Supreme Court found that act unconstitutional due to the infringement of separation of powers between the state government and the federal government. The concept of a living wage is not new. In fact, both Aristotle and Plato discussed it in how it pertains to happiness and self-sufficiency. St. Thomas Aquinas went further and discussed how a just wage should be based on just prices, and just being morally and ethically fair. He even went on further and said that wages should be based on the golden rule. The golden rule is do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Essentially, treat people the way that you want to be treated. There is an individual who lived by that rule so much that he became known as Golden Rule Jones. His name was Samuel M. Jones. He was born into poverty and became a successful business owner and soon a mayor of Toledo, Ohio. His business, the Acme Sucker Rod Company, had only one rule, and that was the golden rule. Treat others the way you want to be treated. In 1894, when he started the company, he implemented a $1.50 to $2 a day wage rate for all of his employees, an 8-hour-a-day work week, paid vacation, revenue sharing, and even subsidized meal plans within the company cafeteria. Today, this would be around $8 to $10 an hour. When he became mayor in 1897, he actually implemented the 8-hour workdays for city employees and opened up free kindergartens and actually established parks and playgrounds for children and the public to use. This man was ahead of his time. Without going directly into the next part of the series, let's discuss why a living wage is important. Does it really affect a lot of people, or is it just like minimum wage where it affects just a small portion of the population? Well, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there are approximately 157 million employed Americans. While the calculation of a living wage will be discussed in the next part of this series, and living wages are dependent upon the location, it is safe to say that approximately 1 in 2 Americans are actually making under a living wage amount. That's half. Look, if it was just 1 out of 100 Americans, we could get by. But when it becomes this serious and 1 in 2 Americans do not make a living wage, that's a serious problem. I know that sounds like an outrageous number, but it's true. With that information, do you believe a living wage is important? Comment below on whether you think a minimum wage or a living wage is more important. I'm really interested to find out. That, my friends, is the history behind a living wage. We have not yet learned about what's going on in today's world regarding a living wage, but that is soon to arrive. Next week, in part 2 of this 5-part series on a living wage, we're going to learn and discuss the calculation behind a living wage. If you've enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And as always, thanks for watching. Until tomorrow.